Hey guys, welcome to my Hildryn guide. Hildryn Prime just came out recently, and I've waited for a pretty long time for her to come out. She's one of the Warframes that doesn't use energy to use her abilities, and we're going to be utilizing it in this build. This is a build for pretty much any kind of content whatsoever. It's ability based, even though you could do a weapon variation on this build. And as you can see in Steel Path, it is wrecking stuff pretty easily due to the fact that she armor strips with Pillage. Pillage is one of the best armor stripping abilities in the game, in so far as it strips both shields and armor. There are very few armor stripping abilities that can do that, and this is one of them. And the order in which you cast Thermal Sunder, which is the ability that we're going for in this build, matters a lot. We're going to be using mostly fire damage to destroy the enemies. And we're also going to use cold damage to CC the enemies. And we're going to use stacking heat damage that eventually we're going to translate into a blast proc to end up killing them once their shield is down, like I'm doing right now. So, as you can see, this build is pretty effective. I'm in no danger of dying or anything like that. The enemies get staggered from the heat procs, and our shields are pretty huge. The only enemies you might have issues with this build are infested, but this takes care of them as well. And Thermal Sunder is good for getting rid of them, where Pillage is not as good. Pillage combines with Blaze to put heat procs on enemies, which I should probably activate. Staggers enemies so that you have a little bit of breathing room, and then you're using Thermal Sunder. Now, I guess I should probably go in a little bit into Thermal Sunder and the way that it works. Basically, you could do cold or heat procs with Thermal Sunder, and if you cast first a cold proc, or sorry, if enemies have a heat proc on them, and then you apply a cold, which they are going to have heat procs because that's what Blaze does, then they get pulled to the, they get a blast proc, and if they have two cold procs on them, they get pulled to the middle. So you could start, for example, by applying two cold procs to pull all enemies to the middle and freeze them. And then you could do a heat proc, which pushes them away, and deals a blast proc. Or you could just apply heat procs with Thermal Sunder only, and that's just gonna stack up the damage, scaling damage on enemies that they're gonna take from heat. And eventually, once they have enough stacks of heat, if you do a cold proc, it then turns all of that heat proc damage into a gigantic blast proc and leaves a cold on them. Essentially what this does is if you start with heat and then you apply cold, it pulls all enemies to the center, and alternatively, if you first apply cold and then heat, it pushes all enemies out, it pushes all enemies back. That is one mechanism of Thermal Sunder, and yep, and the fact, and another one is that if you cast the cold proc twice on enemies, they get frozen in place. Very simple build. I'm gonna leave the mission to show you guys how it works and a few variations on it. You could go a lot of different ways with it. Now we're getting into the far more technical part of the video. This is the build I'm using right here. But one part of this build that you're not really noticing, except in the stats here, is that I'm using some Archon shards. I'm using 2 for strength. That's the bare minimum that you would need if you're copying all of my mods. Uh, because I want to pass the 200 ability strength threshold so that I would only need to cast Pillage twice to armor strip enemies fully instead of 3 times. If I remove any bit of ability strength, let's say I take off Blind Rage, it now only does 26% drain. So I would have to cast this 4 times to basically strip armor from enemies. At 100%, it strips 25%. So you would need to cast it 4 times. That's why we're going for at least 200% ability strength to strip armor from casting this only twice. This is gonna enable us to actually kill enemies way faster, since Pillage, our main spamming ability that we're gonna spam all the time, it's not exactly an ability that you cast and it has a duration and it counts down and that's it. What it does is it expands and then it contracts again. And it does several things when it does this, which is why Pillage is such an amazing ability. It also cleanses status effects from you, which is very, very efficient. In conjunction with Prime Sure-Footed, you will not be knocked down and you'll cleanse yourself from statuses if you keep spamming Pillage. It restores your shields. And gives you overshields, which is what you're going to be using as your energy source and your basically your resource for both your health. Your shields are your health and your energy source at the same time. So you probably have to maintain your shield at all times. And that's why we're using Redirection to increase our base shields by a huge amount. There's other ways to increase shields, but I choose to not go through any of those. Now, I'm using 2 different arcanes to increase our shields once we take damage, which works very well in conjunction with building a lot of base shields with Redirection, because essentially the bare minimum amount of shields we're going to have is 3,753. If we have any less than this and we take damage to our shields, then there's a pretty decent chance that eventually our shields are going to get restored. Now we're using Blazing Pillage in order to apply heat procs to enemies so that it can interact with Thermal Sunder, so that we can apply heat with Haven and Pillage, and then immediately cast a cold proc, which will translate the heat procs into a blast proc and apply cold and consume the heat procs. But it's not a problem to consume heat procs because the heat procs are going to be the main part of our build, which is why we're going with Archon Vitality, despite the fact that Hildryn doesn't really need health so much. But this Archon mod's other secondary effect is just way too good to pass on when it comes to this build, because this is what's going to allow you to completely shred enemies even in Steel Path. Once they have their armor stripped, you're going to be relying on blast procs and heat procs to kill them. So there you go. This doubles the heat procs, meaning it doubles also the blast procs, the eventual blast procs. If you want more information on how exactly that works, read the wiki page on Thermal Sunder. It's a lot to go through. Just note that there's a few differences with how it works natively on Gauss, so keep that in mind. We would go for max range. Let's say if I wouldn't need as much shields, then I would probably get rid of Redirection. And maybe even Umbral Intensify. And this is a different version of this build, where I would go with Adaptation. Adaptation allows me to basically tank a lot more damage from enemies, because we're taking damage to our shields, which is our enemy source. And without doubling without doubling our base shields, we're gonna have a pretty limited shield pool. So we're gonna compensate for that by taking less damage to our shields from enemy incoming damage. This is also pretty reliable, but if you're not playing Steel Path, this is not necessary. I would absolutely go with Redirection instead. So that's one way to take care of being more defensive. And one thing I would change if you want a different version of this and more weapon damage is, I can't really put this right here, but let's go back to Adaptation just so I'll have enough points. A good alternative is going with Thermal Transfer if you're one of those players that likes to do a lot more damage with weapons. And instead of uh, instead of Arcane Barrier, you would go with Malt Augmented. This is going to give you 60 extra ability strength once you kill 250 enemies in a mission, so it's more appropriate in continuous missions. And you would need to use this and maybe use one extra Archon shard or something else to bump your ability strength to above 200, but with this 60 ability strength, you'd get to 199 strength, so any source of extra strength, even growing power, would allow you to be able to cross the 200% threshold, which would allow you again to cast Pillage only twice to shred full armor from enemies. But the reason I went into putting 2 Archon shards as a replacement is so that I don't have to scale up my ability strength to strip armor with 2 pillages. Instead, I'm just going to do it as soon as I start a mission. I won't have to scale into this. It basically starts off with the 50% drain. I would recommend finding some kind of way for you to do that as well, because it's just way faster to kill enemies if you strip their armor and shields with 2 pillages instead of 1. And when it comes to Infested, again, you're going to be basically gaining your shields back only by using Blazing Pillage. Without Blazing Pillage, you're not able to deal with Infested at all, because your abilities drain your shields, and you can't get shields back with Pillage because you have no shields to drain from Infested, as they don't have shields on them. So Blazing Pillage restores shields based on heat damage, which is the only way for you to gain back shields on Infested missions. So this is the reason why I've chosen to make this build the way I did natively with Redirection instead of Adaptation. Again, so as you saw, it does deal with Steel Path enemies just based on having a larger shield pool. And this is also not going to be such a like high defensiveness as Adaptation gives you is not going to be necessary on non-Steel Path missions. So this is going to be versatile for both Steel Path and normal missions, whereas in normal missions, you're probably going to be preferring the higher shield number for basically spamming your abilities more and not running out of energy. And these two are just there to help you basically get your energy back when enemies attack you and when you spam your abilities. So in conjunction with this and with these two arcanes, you're going to be always having your enough energy, quote unquote, which means shields, to spam your abilities nonstop. One note is I've subsumed out the first ability because his weapon is kind of trash, but Aegis Storm is still viable as a CC ability and a way to give your teammates energy. Let's say if you're doing mobile defense or something like that and you need to lock down an area, just note that you can't regain your shields because you can't cast Pillage while you're stuck in Aegis Storm. So you'll have to disable it, cast Pillage, and then immediately cast Aegis Storm, and then Pillage expands and contracts, and that by itself takes a few seconds, and during that whole time you're going to be during Aegis Storm. So again, about the construction, the expansion and contraction of Pillage, it's worthy of noting that as long as Pillage is active, Haven deals damage. So it's not necessarily that when you cast it, it applies to all enemies in the radius, but rather it gives you a few seconds of dynamic radius in which the Haven effect gets applied to all enemies in that dynamic shrinking and expanding radius. Yep, I hope you've enjoyed. Hildryn is amazing, especially for sorties that have missions in them that have a modifier of not being able to use energy. Because Hildryn doesn't require any energy, she could have no limitations on her abilities on those types of missions. And in general, she's a pretty insane armor stripper and DPS. And of course, her being tanky is also pretty nice. In general, she's one of my favorite Warframes. And yeah, now that she got a Prime, I think it's worth getting for pretty much anybody who doesn't have her. Now that she's unvaulted, you should get your hands on Hildryn Prime, absolutely. I hope you guys have a nice day.